Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kim Ricketts, and I manage, along with Kirsten Wiley, the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Today, we get a late summer gift, an hour and a bit with one of the most awarded and most interesting people writing in the field of science fiction and other areas today. And he is here with his latest work, a novel in the vein of the classic science fiction novels of Asimov and Clarke, novels of end times and loops of galactic cities, of what the worlds might look like post-nuclear times, and of a time or times when three young people must fate shift, time travel into and across many dimensions to find a place where they can, perhaps, rescue the future. City at the End of Time has a cool slideshow on Boing Boing. I think we're going to get parts of it from the website today. I invite all of you to check that out after Greg's talk. Greg Bear is the author of more than 30 books of science fiction and fantasy, and he's been awarded 2 Hugo Awards, 5 Nebula Awards, and one of only 2 authors who have been awarded a Nebula in nearly every category. Greg has also served on political and scientific action committees and has advised with his imagination, and thank goodness, everyone from Microsoft Corporation to the U.S. Army, the CIA, Sandia National Laboratories, and even Homeland Security, among many others. Please join me in welcoming Greg Bear back to Microsoft Research.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out today. Well, this is an example of extreme sports. You know, when I was at Google, one of the people there said, why do science fiction writers always like to write about like 1,000,000 years in the future? And I said, no, not 1,000,000 years. This is 100 trillion years in the future, which is much more rational. You know, 1,000,000 years is nothing. It's a drop in a very large bucket. Well, it is extreme sport. It's like, you know, suddenly you have the freedom to go and do almost anything you want within a certain area of discipline. Now, that sometimes leads people to think that they need to have degrees in physics to read a book like this, but you don't need to have a degree in mathematics to read Alice in Wonderland, do you? And I think that's actually one of the progenitors for City at the End of Time, is when you take a look at this book, it's really about satire against current theories of physics, but you don't need to know that. It's really about taking extreme notions of biology and statistics and numerology and everything and running them all together and having fun with them, but you don't need to know that either. And it's about asking questions of people who really are capable of answering, which we probably will at some point today. It's about books, text, and reading. This is a celebration of everyone who's ever loved reading. By the time you're done with this book, you'll go, yeah, I knew it all along. We're in charge here. And you really are. As observers, you really are in charge. And the conclusion of the book is that text is the DNA of the universe. It's not just some little ephemeral thing. You know, ultimately, at the end of time, text is what's going to save all our asses. So it's a metaphysical statement, more of an adventurous metaphysical statement than which is what we're used to in science fiction. So where did I get all this stuff? Well, I got it by channeling all the great United Kingdom, Great Britain, let's just say United Kingdom for now, science fiction and fantasy writers. The British visionaries are the ones who really lead to this book, and that would include, from the beginning, it would include George MacDonald, who wrote The Phantasts and Lilith. It would include Lewis Carroll, whom we're all familiar with. It would include H.G. Wells, who really lit the whole field on fire and wrote a book called The Time Machine that just was a huge bestseller. Sold so very, very well that everyone had to kind of take a crack at it. So a young Irish gentleman named William Hope Hodgson, we think he was young when he wrote this book, penned this huge epic volume called The Nightland, which is set in the very, very far future, in the last city on Earth, with the last remnants of humanity, surrounded by monstrosities. But this was what he conceived of as an evolutionary change. These were naturally evolved monstrosities. However, being Irish, when you read the book, it's more like a horror novel. It's very spooky and mythological, and you have a hard time putting all of this together. So when I read the book, I says, you know, I'm not so sure this is natural evolution. I think this is corruption. I think this is devilish doings. I think this is metaphysical misbehavior going on here. And take his step. When you get to Olaf Stapledon in the 1930s, Olaf Stapledon was a British philosopher in his, I think he was in his late 20s or early 30s. He went down with his wife to the beach, the Shingle Beach, and they were on a cliff top overlooking the shingle beach. They didn't actually get down to the beach. And as they were lying in the sun there, they heard these almost human cries from the beach. And they couldn't figure out what it was. It sounded like babies or children playing or complaining. So they walked over to the edge and looked down, and there were all these sea lions sunning themselves on the shingle. And they were all golden hued and everything, except for the cold water was splashing them, and that's why they were bitching. As they were complaining mightily that they, running, humping along and everything. And Stapledon looked at this and he went, oh my gosh, they sound human. What if they are human? How long would it take humans to become like this? Would they still be intelligent? What if you had, many species of human being evolving into the future? And he has a book, and he puts it out in 1930. It's called Last and First Men. Takes us through 2 billion years of human history and 18 different human species, and ends up on the planet Neptune because the sun has grown large and red and is eating all the inner planets. But to live on Neptune, he's a pretty scientifically savvy guy. He asks himself, well, how could any organic being survive on a high-gravity planet like Neptune? Well, they must be made of artificial matter. That's 1930. 1929 is when he's writing it. Artificial matter. What did he mean by that? We don't know. But when Bill McCarthy and I argue about, he's got programmable matter and I've got fake matter, and we argue about who invented what first, and then I find out by going back to Last and First Men, Olaf was there. About the same time, a man named J.D. Bernal wrote a book called The World, the Flesh, and the Devil, and you all have to go back and read that because he was like 27 years old, just a young dude, getting a career going as a very prominent scientist, and he writes this prospectus on the future, which is utterly amazing to this day because it gives us the idea of generation starships, a bit of Dyson sphere technology, of artificial intelligences, almost anything any science fiction writer is going to be handling through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s pops up in this book. And to this day, it's not really dated. It's still pretty cool. So you add Wells, Bernal, Stapledon, if you add in William Hope Hodgson, then you throw in other people like Tolkien, another British visionary, and go afield a little bit and add in, let's say, Jorge Luis Borges, who was very fond of British literature, and James Branch Cabell, who was a Southern gentleman, was just one offshoot off of I think they call him a Roundhead in England. But at any rate, all these people put together are what got me going for this book, because they all write about not just the future, but about books. They're all in books, of course. They all write books. But all of this stuff, from the fantasy side to Lewis Carroll playing with words to all of that, it's extreme sport. So strip away your boundaries, take it all away. Let's go on a tour. I think we've got this set up here so it'll play. We want large screen or small screen. Is our tech guy still here? Henry? Small sign, okay. He's really in control. So Astrid and I went around Seattle, since Seattle is really the setting for this story, and Seattle is about to become a city at the end of time. Let's run this and show you what we did with Seattle. So, okay. You can see we had great fun doing this, and I've always wanted to be a special effects artist, so suddenly realizing that I could be with Photoshop, and then a website person did the flash animation because I haven't quite gotten into that yet, but Astrid and I took the photos, and she got the Seattle Public Library historical photos for us. So it's a whole family, and then if you go on here, you find out that my daughter is blogging as a character who is not in the book. Has done a very good job kind of stretching the paranoia level. My son has added his Flickr page photographs to the whole thing, and we've put them out as moo cards, and viral promotion, which of course could backfire, and then we get a cold. But we're doing pretty well with that, and we're having a good time. So the whole idea is to go back to the time of City in the Stars, and even before that, to the Time Machine and to the Nightland, and do an update on it with a little bit of a tweak of string theory. Because string theory has gotten kind of interesting in the last decade or so. It's gotten kind of arrogant, and it says that the mathematics is so beautiful it must be true. And us novelists have always thought that was the case when you write a book. It's so beautiful it must be true. But in fact, mathematics is nothing particularly special in the universe. And this really irks people who are programmers when I say that, because we spend so much time and it gives us so much power to use mathematics. But as a metaphysical entity, mathematics is just a branch of language. An equation is really no different than an instruction set in a sentence. It runs you through things in a formal way, to be sure, but it also makes sure that you have to have good information in to get anything useful out. Sometimes very precise information. So it's a very particular subset of regular language. That means that if string theory can't solve our problems, if it creates 2 to the 500th different models of a universe, pick one, and you can't decide between it because the experiment involves godlike powers, then we're kind of at an impasse, aren't we? And I think in biology, mathematically, we've already hit an impasse. We can't even describe the behavior of a relatively complex protein molecule, much less an entire organic system. We just can't do it. We can't do it with mathematics. We can't do it with computers because, as we all know now, computers never boot up the same way twice, right? They're a little unpredictable. They're getting very complicated. They're starting to kind of act like people, and they need to be psychoanalyzed. This is the only way I can repair my computer, is to psychoanalyze the damn thing. And I'd hate to work with, some very, very large system where you have to move, one result over to the next part of the very large system, which kind of involves breaking the Turing machine string. So all of this, it occurs to me now, is the time for text to rise up and to take over again. And I say that because I flunked calculus. So I can handle English language pretty well, but mathematics, I'm a genius level at that, but I don't do the homework. I can't show you the work. So take a warning with that you've got this from a guy who is in fact an English major, not a physics major, but who likes to hang around with physicists and talk and compare notes. And over the years, I've started to know when people were capable of looking for grant money and not admitting that they were then they were then writing science fiction as they make their grant proposals. A lot of high-level physics is science fiction. It really is, always has been. Physicists are allowed to theorize in incredibly diverse ways, which up until maybe modern times, like 2 or 3 months ago, biologists weren't. Biologists were discouraged from positing new theories. No biologist could ever get a PhD if his advisor said, go and prove Darwin wrong. But how many physicists have been told by their advisors, go and prove Einstein wrong? It's an exercise. You do it, But biologists, so I had fun with Darwin's Radio and all these books, kind of tweaking biology and pointing out some of the weird things they didn't have time to read. In this book, it's entirely more undisciplined than that. This is a romp. This is an adventure story. Okay, I've got some questions for you. One of the main topics in this book is a thing called, what I'm now calling a complete library, but it's also been called either a universal library or the Library of Babel. In the book, it's referred to as the Library of Babel in homage to an essay by Jorge Luis Borges by the same name. The Library of Babel in Borges' conception is every single possible permutation of 24, an alphabet of 24 symbols spread through a text, a book-sized text of 420 pages or so. And how long, how big would that entire subset be? It's in Wikipedia. We could probably look it up here. It's like, some huge out-of-the-universe ballpark number. And that's a really fascinating idea to me, because I think you can ask a lot of questions about this Gedanken experiment and lead yourself into a lot of quandaries, which is always good for thinking. The Library of Babel is not infinite, but it is literally huge, unimaginably huge. And sometimes we are frightened by very large numbers, but we love infinities. Infinities are great because they're mathematically tractable, and we don't need to imagine ourselves getting to the end because we'll never get there, so we feel happy with them. But very large numbers daunt us because then it becomes like an office project. You're going to have to take a look at every single one of these volumes spread across this vast universe of bookshelves that Borges postulates. And his essay examined the futility of trying to find meaning in a random universe. Okay, that's good. But this is not an infinite library. In biology, we've actually had this concept that the string of 3 billion base pairs in the human genome could only evolve randomly. So in a sense, as Daniel Dennett has pointed out, it too is a library of Babel. But the mathematics involved in trying to get something coherent out of that string set in that method of doing so is astonishing. It's much, much larger than the library of Babel. So what are our challenges here? We've got this notion of randomness, which has never really been defined in a formal way. We've got the notion of creativity and learning and so on, and looking for texts that are meaningful. This idea of the library of Babel can be very evocative. So I can ask some questions like, of course, that in the library of Babel, every single possible story would be told. That makes perfect sense. Now, you could concatenate certain volumes and put longer books together, but then they're not necessarily going to be created together. But when I threw this idea at Gregory Benford, he says, well, that's just like noise. It's no different from noise. So my first question, class, is how is the library of Babel different from noise? I know it's after lunch, but
complete, right?
It's complete, right? Well, what's that mean?
Organized.
Well, we'd hope. I mean, there's going to be a card catalog in there somewhere, but there's also going to be a huge number of false card catalogs. So
That means it's not random.
why?
Because there's a structure to however the characters were arranged in those 420 pages.
Occasionally, spaced out between huge, incomprehensible, things that could fill your entire God's lifetime trying to read. Yeah.
Incomprehensible to some.
Good point. You see, you're asking all the questions, but you haven't answered. You're getting on to my later questions, but you haven't answered this one yet. Yeah.
So because it has every possible permutation, there's something useful in the library.
You hope.
Whereas with noise, there's no guarantee, no matter how long you listen, that you'll find something that's useful.
Right. So that's basically the answer to the question. Yes, sir.
I was just going to say, it's exhaustive, but it's not repetitive.
There you go. Excellent. Boy, it took me months to figure that out, and you guys get it in 2 minutes. That's perfect. That's just what I expected. It doesn't repeat. The library of Babel is not allowed to repeat. That is not a trivial problem. How do you prevent the library of Babel from repeating itself? How do you keep track of what you've already generated? Now, some programmers talk to me in vague, hand-waving terms of a program that actually allows you to prevent any repetitious results. I don't know if that's possible or not.
Random, or whether it's like just a bunch of nested loops.
Yeah. Well, this one you can't allow it to be random. It has to generate a new variant of a text or a string of text every single time, and it cannot repeat that variant, ever. So if you guys figure this out, we can patent it. Forget publishing, we'll just produce random books and send them out there. Okay, the next question is, what is not in the library of Babel? What could you not have in this finite? Yes?
Microsoft intellectual property.
You have to prove it's in there first before you sue us, guys. So, good point, though.
It can't be represented with those 24 symbols.
Well, but you can represent practically anything in an ASCII code set. Numbers, symbols, Chinese symbols. I mean, how do we do Chinese symbols? And so even that, but what it cannot be in here are infinitely long things, like pi. Because pi is infinitely long. It's never been proven that pi is random, but I want you guys to take 1 trillion digits of pi and put it through a compression algorithm and see what you get. No compression. Just won't compress. So that's a pretty good indicator at the first level that pi is relatively random. Yeah?
Because there's so many things in it, is it provable or not that you can take consecutive books and construct pi from them?
Well, you probably could, right? But that's a great question. That leads to the next question is, now we have ways of generating pi within the library, all the equations necessary there, true and false. I mean, you could have false ways of generating pi, which don't work. You could have super science ways of generating varieties of pi that we never even think of. You know, 11-dimensional pi circles or hyperspheres or whatever. I'm sure that's doable. But the next question leads us is, if pi is random, which has never been proven, and is infinitely long, then are there subsets of pi which contain the universal library? Good. First answer, anybody disagree? It really becomes an interesting mathematical problem, doesn't it? Because if pi is totally random and never produces anything sensible, which is kind of a definition of randomness, then you couldn't have a universal library within pi, or any variation thereof, because there are occasionally texts within, in fact, large numbers of text. Every possible text in the universe would be contained within pi, which means that the meaning of the universe could be contained within pi, which is a paradox if it's random and unanalyzable. And also if it is totally unshrinkable, can't be condensed using algorithms, JPEGs or whatever you want. You know, zipping, can't do that. So when Carl Sagan wrote Contact, he threw this idea out that if you looked at pi in the right way, you would get a message from God or some alien civilization, leaving a message in our metaphysics. And the mathematicians just jumped all over him back in the 1970s. They said, this is impossible, pi is random, and you know this is just nonsense. Okay, was Carl right? Now it'll take you, a very, very long period of time to find anything in there. But as people who are numerate, you can actually, I think, begin to realize and win yourself a field prize by using this as an entry point into the question of whether or not pi is totally random and what the meaning of randomness is. Is pi noise? Well, yes, because it repeats. It could easily repeat, but we don't know that it repeats. So next question before we head off into talking more about the story here, because I'm sure you guys love this stuff when you're off work. Brain-bending stuff. The next question is, at what point does pi denature and become like any other infinite string random number, such that it loses the character that started it off as pi in the first place? Is it 10 digits, 3 digits down, 5, 20, 50, 10 million, a trillion? That means that at a certain point, any mathematically precise system just goes off into the vagaries of noise. And that's an interesting mathematical result. So all of this comes out of my English major reading of Jorge Luis Borges and Hans-Heinz Urs, who wrote the first essay on this, and George Gamow, who talked about it in his book 1, 2, 3, Infinity. That's probably where I think a lot of us got introduced to the concept. In this book, it turns out that you need the universal library, maybe, to save the universe. Because what better guideline for creating an entire huge, diverse universe than all possible stories and all possible randomness variation that can be used to generate particle trails or alternate histories or whatever. All this stuff. We look at the scale of the universe. Do you really believe that a simple theory of everything, a simple one equation, can describe all of that? I don't know. But this is all the stuff behind here, which is kind of like you don't need to know any of it to enjoy the book. But when you do and you come across these concepts, you're going to be introduced to a fellow called the librarian, who has, in fact, at the end of time almost, managed to create a thing in a mini-cosm, a very small but very, very condensed universe that is the equivalent of a universal library. And that's a very powerful object, especially when you bring in the fact that the muses are real. But they don't just inspire artists and writers and dancers and so on. This muse is about memory. And her job is to take everything that's been observed in the universe and correct the bookkeeping. Okay? Now, I'm sure you've been hearing about these physics results that show that you can entrain photons, and there's just a thing in nature recently. You can entrain a photon and send it off in 2 different directions, 2 different photons in 2 different directions, and they still know all the gossip connected with the other photon. They still know everything. They know what's going on with the other photon. Apparently, the instantaneous or near instantaneous transmission it's not explainable in any other way. It is like a Bell continuum message going between them. And they can communicate at least at 100,000 times the speed of light. They can't measure beyond that. Now they're getting more and more interesting results which are not quantum mechanically reprehensible, but do in fact kind of knock our socks off with regards to things like special relativity. This really worried Mr. Einstein. I recall the dialogue when something like, God doesn't play dice with the universe, and then Niels Bohr says, Albert, don't tell God what to do. So we don't know what God is up to. In this novel, he's sleeping. As any Hindu would tell us is the truth. Creation is there, God is bored, Brahma sleeps. When Brahma wakes up, then things will get interesting. So we have a lot of fun here, and you can see that by metaphysically messing with Seattle and making it one of these cities that are at the end of time, we're squashing Seattle up against the future 100 trillion years from now. Wonderful fun. So if you've read City in the Stars recently, I highly recommend you go back and reread it. It's a great book. It doesn't have anybody in the present in it, but H.G. Wells and William Hope Hodgson and Olaf Stapledon tended to have either people from the far future coming back to tell us the story, or people living in the present going forward to the far future to see it. And that's how I've structured this book. It's a little easier to get across if you have a contemporary viewpoint character who is just as puzzled as you are about what the heck is going on. It avoids a lot of narrative lumps. And there are enough narrative lumps in most of my books that the scientists are reasonably contented. But in this one, the puzzles will never get solved just by reading this text. You're going to have to find the alternate texts from the Universal Library that go on at much greater length that I never wrote. So any questions on all of this? Sorry on your lunch break to throw all these questions at you, but I know you guys are like super athletes. You guys are extreme sports types, so I know that.
Have you thought at all about like the mythology of the word itself? Like Tolkien did extensive research into creating how the word was conceived, the beliefs, the whole system behind it. Lewis Carroll as well did some work into that is now being twisted into a new story lately, right, by another author that did a good job. So have you ever touched that point, like to kind of establish the social relation on that word and how the religion itself played a role on that?
Oh yeah, whenever we write science fiction we have to do that. The whole culture determines the word. And we certainly learned that when we studied linguistics. So if you're running an alien civilization, then you can do that too, and to the extent that you have the time or the space to lay back their history. And if you translate that word into English, it must be evocative. So nearly all my books, when you come across alien words, they seem slightly strange to us. In Anvil of Stars, the species that the kids encounter in deep space is called the red tree runners. What's that mean? What's that come from? So in a sense, we can play with just poetics, because the universe is full of mystery and poetry. We may never understand it, but the talent of any imaginative writer is to give you the feeling that there is an explanation. And in a sense, that's what religion does when you describe the gods, and then you say, what are they like? Well, they are not this and not that. I can't tell you what they are, but I can only tell you what they aren't. So yeah, very good question. In this book, we have the far future language is translated for us. And even the units are not metric, they're basic, because you can just assume that they're not going to be metric that far in the future either, so we might as well make it easy for us, right? And yeah.
I noticed one of the quotes, actually there it is, from Stephen Baxter. It's kind of creepy. It said that this is a book that you'll be remembered for, which is bad and kind of creepy. So if you were ever, let's just say, to retire from writing, would you want this to be the book you remembered for? And also, I noticed that you and two other authors wrote kind of prequels in a way to the Asimov's Foundation trilogy. Would you want somebody doing that to one of your works, or would you want them to do that to this one?
Well, I don't know about Isaac. I sort of channeled Isaac when I was writing the Foundation book, and that was fun to have him sitting on my shoulder. He disagreed that he was still alive. He was pretty much a secular agnostic, so he didn't believe in life after death. And so we argued about that a little bit. But yeah, it's hard to say. We're not in control. The fact is, the ego is not important after a few trillion years. You know, and if this is my masterpiece, that's fine. You know, as long as someone's reading something 1 trillion years from now, I'll be happy. If only a scattered fragment of ash left over from the supernova and the end of that particular corner of the universe, that'd be cool. On the other hand, you know, I think the gods tell us, you know, don't expect to hang around just because you want to. You know, there's no particular reason why we should keep all of you around, or even the best parts. So humility is, I think, kind of in order after 100 trillion years. I mean, the entire history of the universe is buried under the city known as the Kalpa. It was just too bulky, and so they broke it up into rubble and scattered it as the foundation of a new city about 10 trillion years ago. And ever since then, they just don't know what the beginning, what they call the brightness, what that was like. You understand, when Jeff says this is after the heat death of the universe, literally, the universe is going to die, we hear, in 15 billion years or something like that. We don't know. But something in that range, and I figure, okay, so it does, you know, it goes on a little longer than that because our physics isn't quite right. It stretches out, it starts to get seedy, it starts to come apart like a bad veil, bad piece of lace, and so you've got all these seams and openings, and particles start to decay, and, you know, constants start to change. It's like a decaying log in a forest. Now, in the ecological system of universes and meta-universes, this is an opportunity for other entities to come in and seed themselves in this log. We are unfortunately about to be seeded by a malevolent, failed god. And that's the thing that challenges the city at the end of time, the Typhon. And the Typhon has moved in and is not happy with anything that makes sense. So that's the metaphysical disease that I postulated, you know, occurring in Hodgson's The Nightland, and in this case I make it manifest. Yeah?
So talk about the decaying log in the forest and the humility of creation. When you're writing, and a lot of writers do this, you're building a world, when do you know to stop? Because I think we as readers, and in some cases writers, don't want to reveal everything because you tire everybody out.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of us are familiar with series that really needed to stop 20 years ago. So how do you know? So how do you know when to stop?
When people stop buying the books. I mean, there's a very good indication there that the story is over when no one's reading it, right? That's the unhumble version. I wanted to kind of do this as 3 volumes. The publisher said do it as 1. That's a commercial decision, so some of it gets squozed down a bit. But on the other hand, I think it works fine as it is. You leave them wanting more is usually my conception. And I've generally found that the really, really intelligent readers don't want to have everything explained to them in infinite detail. Well, on the other hand, you got something like Tolkien's world, and it's marvelous. I mean, you could go on for a long time, and people have. They want to know more. It's a rich, rich world. So it depends on the originality and the organic quality of your creation. If it lives outside of what you're capable of doing, then it's a good series. So Robert Jordan is about to have his new book coming out, and that's probably not a bad thing. And then you get V.C. Andrews, who's been writing for 20 years now, and she's been dead for 20 years. That's impressive. That's longevity. Yeah. Yeah.
When thinking about how information mutates, when your books are translated into other languages, do you get a chance to follow along and see what the changes are?
Well, quite often the translators will come back to me and ask questions. So I just got a note from my Israeli Hebrew translator who's translating Quantico and wants to ask certain questions. That's fine. I try to help them in any way I can, but I can only really do it by explaining, what this weird colloquial thing might mean. I can't turn it into something for them. Also, a lot of words in science fiction books are in and of themselves supposed to be the words of the future, but they're evocative, like we were talking about. So how do you translate that into something like Finnish or Russian? Russian is probably easier than Finnish, but Japanese, very hard. So quite often what they do is they do a literal translation of it. They just don't translate at all. And that can be difficult. Good question, though. Translators really have a hard time. And you think of some of the best translations that have actually taken a work of literature and made it a new work of literature in another language, something like Remembrance of Things Past, which is revered as a great translation. Samuel Butler's translation of Cervantes, which is excellent. These things are in themselves masterpieces. A lot of dedication there. Anything else? Yeah.
What
What process do you use to plot and write something this complex?
One damn thing after another. Basically, the organic nature of it is clear. The themes are clear at a certain point, about 1/3 of the way through the book. I've set myself up goals along the way, kind of like, you know, road markers that I want to get to, things I think will be fun to write, and then you have to integrate all those. And the only way to do that is to have the subconscious do that. So I really am beholden to the muse here. And to make her a character in the book, I think is particularly catering, you know, to the gods. She's a pretty massive, impressive character in this book, very frightening in places. And that's just the way I look at her, actually. Cool.
What are librarians' response to that?
I haven't heard much about that yet. You know, there's also a book group club in here, too, women's book group club called the Witches of Eastlake. They call themselves that. There's 4 of them, and there are, you know, they really are major characters in the book, and turn out to be slightly metaphysical too. And this is another bit of catering, putting, you know, librarians and women's book clubs in there. Come on, guys, you should read more science fiction. Man. Haven't heard from Nancy Pearl yet. We'll see. You know, people tell me that this is not a. I get 2 different things from the United Kingdom. One of the reviews in the UK said this book reads like an airport novel, reads very, very quickly. And for Library Journal, they said this book is for heavy-duty readers of science fiction. So I presume that in the United Kingdom, their IQs are vastly higher than they are here in the United States. I can only presume that. But the fact is, I think this is a very easy book to read. You just have to kind of go with the flow, you know. Don't try to understand it all. It's a little easier to understand than Finnegan's Wake, but it reads a heck of a lot faster. So, one more question, then we sign books and let you guys run off, or how much time we got here? Okay.
You talk a lot, like time traveling has been something vastly touched by, you know, like several authors, right? Some of them people don't even remember anymore, or classic. But how you approach to the whole time traveling, because there's like physics nowadays that touch it a little bit, like Universe in a Nutshell, he talks about it, right? So how you perceive the whole thing and how you approach to time travel itself. I see a little bit that it's like the mind moving, not necessarily the body. So why you have this?
Well, in this book, the universe doesn't, when the universe comes to an end, it doesn't just end at the end. It's a whole 5 or more dimensional construct, a unity that starts to decay from beginning to end. So once the decay begins, what you have is what we could call well, it's the reverse of original sin. It's the sin of the end of time coming back to haunt us. So anything you want different in this universe is caused by corruption at the end of time. If you think things are going badly now, just wait a little bit. You know, 5th dimensional little bits. It's going to get worse. And when Seattle is cut loose and smeared up against the future, it's because literally the universe is being digested into little gobbets that float free in multidimensional space. And they have their own kind of cohesive metaphysical set of units which are slowly frittering away. But also this universe is a multidimensional universe, and each one of these dimensions, you know, can fan off supposedly into an infinite number of dimensions. I pare that down a little bit. I can make the metaphor more like Richard Feynman's Sum Over Histories and particle trails. When Feynman says that a particle can travel every possible route to get to where it is going to be, then it sums itself down, mathematically, the physicist does anyway, to the least energy course, pathway. Well, that's how our universes work too, until things start to get corrupt. And then you can actually shunt off into a pathway that never should have been preserved. And those places are nasty. So there are other parts of this, you know, like why do we dream? We dream because we shed the memories of those pathways we never took. It's a physics process. You got to get rid of these things. You don't need them. You never took those paths. And if you have, you know, really weird dreams, maybe that indicates that those pathways were, you know, you should have avoided them to start with. They were pretty nightmarish or even Lovecraftian. So if the actual laws of physics are changing because the universe is dying, then almost anything can happen. And that leads us to all the stuff that kind of separates science fiction from horror and supernatural literature and fantasy and all of that. it really becomes part and parcel of the same thing. Maybe because we shed some of our stories when we dream. Is that good?
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming.